It had been an ordinary wedding portrait until the moment you focused closely on the bride's hand and uncovered a terrible, hidden truth. The soft glow of the late sun streamed through the high windows of the Atlanta Historical Archive, where Dr. Rebecca Morrison was conducting a meticulous review of a recently donated set of early 20th century images from an unknown source. Nestled between aged group shots and formal individual portraits, one picture made her freeze. It was a wedding photograph dated 1903. A Caucasian gentleman, dressed stiffly in a dark three-piece suit, was positioned next to an African-American woman wearing a detailed, ornate white wedding dress. Their hands were locked together in a space between them, a pose that should have suggested connection and affection. Rebecca's decade and a half of experience as a historical archivist had trained her to detect irregularities. This picture radiated a profound sense of incorrectness on numerous levels. In the Georgia of 1903, a marriage between different races was not merely frowned upon, it was expressly forbidden by law. The state's anti-miscegenation statutes, established in the mid-18th century and reinforced following the Civil War, rendered such relationships criminal acts, with penalties that included jail time. Yet here was visual proof of what seemed to be precisely that kind of union. She flagged the image for a high-resolution digital scan, a deep and troubling sensation settling in her stomach. A fortnight later, as she was carefully studying the enhanced digital files, Rebecca methodically enlarged different sections of the photograph. She examined the painted studio scenery, the delicate jewelry adorning the woman, the severe and unyielding look on the man's face. Finally, she centered the view on their intertwined hands. As she magnified the image further, a chill descended through her body. The bride's fingers were not simply placed there passively. They were arranged with clear, deliberate purpose, her thumb and forefinger creating a subtle yet distinct and recognized silent call for aid. Rebecca's own hands shook as she zoomed in even closer. The woman's digits were posed with unmistakable intent, concealed within what looked like a simple gesture of matrimony, but were in fact a desperate cry for intervention. This was not merely evidence of a forbidden wedding, it was proof of something much more dark and threatening. A muted scream had been captured within the frame for over 12 decades, waiting for a person to eventually notice it and comprehend its terrible significance. Rebecca promptly reached out to Dr. Marcus Williams, an expert in African American historical studies and the documentation of the Jim Crow period. When he came to her office that night, she presented him with the photograph without any preliminary comments. Marcus inspected it wordlessly, his face gradually shifting into a mask of deep concern. "This is an impossibility," he stated at last. "Georgia's anti-miscegenation laws in 1903 rendered this an unthinkable event." He paused. Unless what?" Rebecca inquired, though she dreaded the response she anticipated. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression solemn. "Unless this was not a legitimate marriage in any sense. Unless this image records something completely different. Duress, imprisonment, or something more horrific. Observe her face. That is not the look of a joyful bride. That is the look of sheer terror, barely held in check." They dedicated hours to scrutinizing every element. The studio's imprint identified it as the Morrison and Wright Portrait Studio, located in Atlanta, Georgia, from August of 1903. A barely visible handwritten note on the reverse side stated simply, "Mr. Charles Whitfield and servant." Servant, not wife, not bride, servant. The word lingered in the air between them like an oath. "He didn't even bother to conceal what she represented to him," Marcus murmured softly. "This picture was never intended to commemorate a union. It was meant to display possession." Rebecca felt a wave of nausea. But why the wedding gown? Why stage the scene in this manner? Marcus accessed historical databases on his portable computer. Control, degradation. During this era, some white men of power exerted their dominance over black women in horrific manners. They could not legally wed them, but they could still compel them into scenarios that grotesquely imitated marriage. A cruel charade that served their twisted wants while preserving their public reputation. The woman would have had no legal rights, no safety, no means of escape. That evening, Rebecca found sleep impossible. She could not stop seeing the woman's face, her strategically placed fingers, the silent plea that had traveled through more than 100 years. What was her name? What became of her? And the question that haunted her most of all: did anyone recognize her signal at the time, or had it remained unseen until now, tragically too late to offer any help? The following day, Rebecca and Marcus commenced their research at the Georgia State Archives. Their objective was to determine the identities of both individuals in the picture. The name Charles Whitfield was their initial clue. The archivist, an older black woman called Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, who had dedicated 35 years to the institution, grew visibly rigid upon hearing the name. "Charles Whitfield," she repeated, her voice measured and low. "That is a name that still holds influence in some quarters, though not the sort anyone should boast about." She retreated into the record storage area and came back, carrying several document boxes. The Whitfield family was a leading name in Atlanta from the 1872nd until the 1920s. They built their wealth in post-war cotton and textile manufacturing. Charles Whitfield took control of the family enterprise in 1898. She opened a census ledger. The 1,900 census documents are Charles Whitfield, 28 years of age, residing in a substantial home on Peachtree Street with substantial wealth and a long list of domestic staff within his residence. A sense of dread coiled in Rebecca's stomach as she scanned the names. They were all black women and girls, their ages spanning from 14 to 30. One entry in particular drew her eye. Louisa, age 16, domestic servant, literate. Marcus, meanwhile, located property deeds confirming Whitfield's ownership of multiple Atlanta holdings, among them a textile mill that employed dozens, primarily black women and children, under harsh and dangerous conditions for meager pay. Period newspapers lauded him as a forward-thinking business leader and a cornerstone of the community. The chasm between his public persona and the reality they were piecing together was profoundly disturbing. Their next challenge was to identify the woman in the photograph. Listed merely as a servant, her name was a mystery. Mrs. Hayes, however, offered a suggestion. If the portrait was taken in August of 1903, they should scour the city archives for any missing persons filings or reports of strange occurrences from that period. Sometimes, she explained, families would attempt to report a missing daughter, even though the authorities seldom took action. After 2 full days of sifting through incomplete and fragmented public documents, Marcus discovered a police report from September 1903. It was terse and dismissive, but it offered their first tangible lead. The report had been filed by Henry and Martha Johnson concerning their daughter, Louisa Johnson, aged 19, who was employed in the Exhalation, Whitfield household. The family stated they had not seen her in over a month, despite her living just 2 miles away. The report noted that Mr. Whitfield had asserted Miss Johnson was merely fulfilling her contractual obligations and was in good health. The official conclusion was, no evidence of wrongdoing. Case closed. Rebecca cross-referenced the name with the 1900 census. There she was, Louisa Johnson, aged 16 in 1900, residing with her parents and 3 younger siblings in a small home near Auburn Avenue. Her father, Henry, was a carpenter. Her mother, Martha, took in laundry. The family was literate and owned their modest property. They were a part of Atlanta's aspiring black middle class, struggling to build a life under the oppressive shadow of Jim Crow. Marcus uncovered further records. In 1902, Henry Johnson had been badly hurt in a construction site accident, leaving him unable to work. The family had subsequently fallen into significant debt. A note in a local church's charity ledger showed they had petitioned for assistance in early 1903. "This is how he did it," Marcus said, his voice thick with a mixture of rage and grief. Whitfield had seen a chance, a family in a vulnerable position, a young woman with few choices. He had offered employment, likely promising fair compensation. Then they discovered a letter within the church archives, written by Martha Johnson to the pastor in July of 1903. "We have not laid eyes on our Louisa in 3 weeks," it read. "Mr. Whitfield claims she is well and working diligently, but he will not permit us to see her. He states it would disturb the running of the household. Reverend, my spirit tells me something is terribly amiss. My daughter has never failed to write to us each week, yet we have received no letters. When I went to his home, the other servants would not meet my gaze. I beg of you, can you offer any help?" The pastor's reply was jotted in his personal journal. "Spoke with Mr. Whitfield about the Johnson girl. He assured me she is in good health and spirits, merely occupied with her responsibilities. He expressed irritation at the family's persistent worries and implied they were being ungrateful for his Christian charity in providing her with work. I am inclined to take him at his word. The Johnsons must have faith in God's plan and avoid creating difficulties for a respected gentleman who has shown them kindness." Following a different trail, Rebecca located the records of the Morrison and Wright Portrait Studio through the Georgia Historical Society. The studio had been in business from 1895 until 1910, and, remarkably, some of its materials had been preserved by the photographer's descendants. She made contact with James Morrison, the great-grandson of the studio's founder, William Morrison. James invited them to his home in Decatur, where he maintained a comprehensive personal archive of his great-grandfather's career. William Morrison photographed the elite of Atlanta for 15 years, James explained, leading them into his study. He kept meticulous daily journals about his clients and his work. He was also, quietly, the son of an abolitionist and often grappled with having to photograph the darker facets of Southern society. He retrieved a leather-bound journal from the shelf for August 1903. "I've read through all of these over the years. Some entries have never left me. This is one of them." He opened the book to a page marked by a faded ribbon and began to read aloud. "August 17th, 1903. Today, I performed what may be the most unsettling task of my professional life. Charles Whitfield commissioned a wedding portrait, yet no marriage has taken place. The young Negro woman he brought to my studio was plainly not present of her own volition. She was dressed in an expensive gown that did not fit her correctly, and her eyes held a terror so profound I very nearly refused the commission. The woman, he never used her name, only referred to her as girl, began to shake when he took her hand. As I arranged their hands for the picture, I observed bruising around her wrists. When I looked into her eyes to direct her gaze toward the camera, I saw a profound desperation. She was attempting to communicate something, but with Whitfield monitoring her every breath, she was rendered silent. James turned the page, his own voice tightening with emotion. As I was preparing for the exposure, I saw her fingers shift subtly, arranging themselves into what seemed a very intentional configuration, a possible signal. I remained quiet, but I ensured the camera captured it with perfect clarity. I took 3 separate exposures. Whitfield was insistent on obtaining a flawless image. He continued reading. "After they had departed, I was overcome with a physical sickness. I understood that what I had photographed was not a celebration of marriage, it was documentation of a crime. But what action could I take? Report it to the authorities? They would have mocked me for implying a gentleman of Whitfield's social standing could do any wrong." Marcus widened their investigation, conducting a more thorough examination of Whitfield's past. What they pieced together from court archives, property deeds, and old newspaper articles revealed a years-long pattern of exploitation. Between 1899 and 1905, a minimum of 6 families had lodged complaints concerning daughters who had taken domestic positions with Whitfield and then vanished from all communication with their relatives. Every instance followed a familiar script: a black family in financial distress, a young woman, typically aged 16 to 20, hired for housework, initial correspondence that abruptly ceased, relatives being refused visitation, and police reports that were filed and promptly ignored. In 2 instances, the young women resurfaced months later, their spirits, clearly shattered, refusing to discuss what they had endured. Rebecca located a testimony from a woman named Sarah, who had been employed by Whitfield in 1901. She had provided a statement to a black community group that documented abuses by white employers, a record that survived only because it existed outside the official systems that refused to acknowledge such grievances. "Mr. Whitfield kept 3 of us in the house," Sarah's statement read. "We were forbidden from leaving. He told us that if we tried, he would have our families arrested for theft or our fathers lynched. He did whatever he wished with us. We were his property in everything but name." The testimony went on. "There was a girl there when I first came. She couldn't have been more than 16. She was kept in a room on the 3rd floor, and we were not permitted to speak to her. I could hear her crying at night. After a few weeks, she was just gone. Mr. Whitfield claimed she had stolen from him and run off, but I knew the truth. She would not have left. She was too terrified of what he would do to her family. I managed to get out because my brother threatened to make a scene and go to the newspapers. Whitfield released me to avoid attracting scrutiny, but I know others were not so lucky. Marcus uncovered documents proving Whitfield had deep ties to local law enforcement and city officials. He was a consistent donor to political campaigns and frequently hosted social events for Atlanta's powerful elite. He operated with total impunity, Marcus stated, his tone bitter. The system was designed to protect him. The police served his interests. The courts bowed to his influence, and black families had zero recourse. Their daughters could be taken, mistreated, or even killed, and there was absolutely nothing they could do. Despite the overwhelming darkness of their findings, Rebecca kept her focus fixed on Louisa. The photograph revealed more than just victimhood. It revealed resistance. The hand signal, preserved forever in that image, was a deliberate act of defiance, a refusal to let her captivity remain a secret. She knew, Rebecca said, looking at the photograph once more. She knew that picture might be the only proof, so she embedded a message within it. Through Martha Johnson's persistent letters to various organizations and churches, they tracked the family's increasingly frantic efforts to locate their daughter. In October of 1903, Henry Johnson, despite his injuries, attempted to force his way into Whitfield's residence. He was arrested for trespassing and creating a public disturbance, serving a 2-week jail sentence. The incident was reported in the papers, but the coverage was entirely sympathetic to Whitfield, portraying him as a prominent businessman harassed by a deranged former employee's relative. Martha wrote to the newly established Atlanta chapter of the NAACP in 1903. "My daughter is being held against her will by Charles Whitfield," she pleaded. "She entered his home as an employee and is now his captive. I have not seen her in 4 months. She would never willingly abandon her family. I beg of you, someone must help us. We have pursued every legal channel, and no one will listen because we are Negroes." "Negro and he is white and wealthy," the NAACP responded, but their investigation immediately encountered the same immovable barriers. Their attorney, a black man named Robert Foster, tried to secure a writ of habeas corpus. The judge declined to issue it, declaring there was no proof of unlawful imprisonment and intimating that the Johnson family was leveling baseless allegations against a pillar of the community in a scheme to extract money. Foster carefully recorded the details of the case, but he could proceed no further without endangering his own security and professional standing. Then, Marcus discovered an unexpected clue, a letter from December 1903, written by a white woman named Eleanor Hartwell, who had lived next door to Whitfield. She wrote to her sister in Boston, "A profoundly disturbing situation is unfolding next door. Charles Whitfield has a young Negro woman in his home, whom he identifies as a servant, but the circumstances feel much more ominous. I caught one glimpse of her looking down from an upstairs window. Her face was marked with bruises. I tried to speak with her when Charles was absent, but the other staff, who seemed terrified, would not permit me entry. I am contemplating reporting this to the authorities, but I fear no one will take me seriously or even care." The trail for Louisa's story grew cold after December 1903, and Rebecca began to fear the worst. But then Marcus made a discovery in an unanticipated location, the archived records of the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C. An entry from March 1904 noted the admission of a woman named Louisa, who had been found near the train station with severe injuries by members of a black mutual aid society. The hospital documentation was brief but telling, female patient, approximately 20 years of age. Provided first name Louisa, but declined to give a surname. Presents with multiple injuries in various stages of healing, including fractured ribs, lacerations, and indicators of sustained physical abuse. Patient is profoundly traumatized and largely non-verbal, demonstrates intense fear of men, particularly white men. Patient has suggested she escaped from a location in Georgia, but will not offer specifics, stating, "He will murder my family if I tell." Rebecca's pulse quickened as she read on. The hospital had reached out to a local organization dedicated to assisting women who had escaped from servitude and abusive circumstances. A social worker named Catherine Wells had taken charge of Louisa's case. Her notes provided greater insight. "This young woman has endured unspeakable trauma. She startles at any sudden noise and suffers from nightmares that disturb the entire ward. Over several weeks, she has slowly shared fragments of her story: forced captivity, repeated assaults, complete isolation from her kin, and continuous threats against her family if she tried to flee." Catherine's notes from April 1904 recorded Louisa's own words: "I was trapped in that house for 8 months. He stole everything from me. My liberty, my self-respect, my bond with my family. The photograph he made me take in that white dress was the most terrible day. He wished to pretend I was his wife, that I had chosen to be there. But I made certain to leave a message in that picture. I arranged my fingers in a specific way, a call for help I had once read about in a book. I did not know if anyone would ever notice it, but I had to try. I needed there to be some proof that I had not gone with him willingly." The records indicated that Catherine had assisted Louisa in contacting her family through carefully disguised messages to prevent alerting Whitfield. In May 1904, Louisa's mother, Martha, received a letter. "Mama, I am alive. I cannot tell you where I am, only that I am safe now and am recovering. The man who held me thinks I am dead. Please, you must let him continue to believe that. It is the only way to ensure you, father, and my siblings remain safe. I will write again when it is possible. I love you. Your daughter." Marcus located the final piece of the puzzle in the Atlanta newspaper archives from March 1904. A brief article was headlined, "Fire at Whitfield Residence Claims a Life." It reported, "Authorities confirm a devastating fire occurred at the home of prominent businessman Charles Whitfield last evening. One servant perished in the flames. Mr. Whitfield stated the young Negro woman, whose name was not recorded, had been negligent with a cooking fire. The remains were too severely burned for identification. The event is being treated as a tragic accident." However, a black newspaper, the Atlanta Independent, presented a different account in a cautiously phrased article. Sources inside the Negro community report that the servant who supposedly died in the recent fire at the Whitfield property had, in reality, escaped weeks prior. Multiple witnesses report observing a young woman, matching her description, fleeing the grounds in February. The fire appears to have been intentionally set to conceal her escape and to intimidate other potential witnesses. Police have refused to pursue the matter further. Louisa had managed to escape, and Whitfield had fabricated the story of her death in a fire to explain her disappearance. He had created this fiction to protect his reputation and to deter any further inquiry, ensuring that as far as the official record was concerned, the case was tragically closed. Could not admit she had escaped without exposing the truth of her imprisonment. To preserve his respectable public image, he invented a fictitious death and continued with his life. For the Johnson family, this meant they could never openly acknowledge their daughter was alive without endangering her safety. Rebecca and Marcus uncovered a series of letters exchanged over many years between Martha Johnson and Catherine Wells. Catherine had assisted Louisa in establishing a new identity and a new life in Washington, D.C. She found employment as a dressmaker and eventually received training to become a nurse. In 1908, she married a compassionate man named Edward, who worked for the Postal Service. They raised 4 children together, but Louisa never went back to Atlanta, and her parents were forced to maintain the public pretense that their daughter had perished. Marcus found that Louisa preserved her history in her own manner. In 1925, she provided a testimony to a commission looking into racial violence and exploitation in the southern states. She did not use her legal name, but she shared her account. "I was 19 years old when a white man took me from my family and held me captive for 8 months. He was able to do this because the law offered no protection for people who looked like me. He was confident no one would believe me if I told. He knew my family possessed no power to rescue me, but I endured, and I want my account to be officially recorded so that one day, when the world is prepared to listen, people will understand what happened to women like me." Rebecca and Marcus dedicated 6 months to assembling their findings into a thorough historical record. They tracked Louisa's lineage through Washington, D.C. archives and located her great-granddaughter, Dr. Michelle Foster, a professor of African American history at Howard University. When Rebecca contacted her, Michelle's reaction was immediate and deeply emotional. "My family has been waiting for someone to uncover this story," she said. They convened at Michelle's home, where she had carefully safeguarded all of Louisa's remaining personal effects. "My great-grandmother lived until 1978, Michelle explained. "She was 94 years old, and she never forgot what happened to her in Atlanta. She shared the story with us when we were mature enough to comprehend it. She made us promise to safeguard it, to ensure it was not lost. She said, 'Someday, someone will discover that photograph, and when they do, I want them to know the complete truth.'" Michelle showed them Louisa's private writings, which included a journal she maintained in her later years. One entry stated, "I have built a good life in spite of the wrong that was inflicted upon me. I raised 4 wonderful children. I helped deliver dozens of babies into this world as a nurse. I loved and was loved in return, but I never forgot those 8 months, and I never forgot my parents' suffering. That photograph exists somewhere, containing my silent plea, frozen forever. I pray that one day a person will look at it and understand. I pray that my story will help people recognize the multitude of women who suffered in silence, trapped by laws that denied our humanity within a society that willfully ignored our pain." The National Museum of African American History and Culture curated an exhibition titled Silent Testimony: Louisa's Story and the Concealed History of Jim Crow Captivity. The focal point was the 1,903 photograph displayed beside the photographer's journal, the hospital records, the family correspondence, and Louisa's own testimony. The exhibition text was direct and uncompromising. "This photograph documents not a marriage, but a crime. It depicts a young black woman held captive by a white man who faced no legal repercussions because the judicial and social structures of Jim Crow America afforded him complete immunity." At the opening ceremony, Michelle stood before the photograph with tears on her face. Positioned next to the 1,903 image was a portrait of Louisa from 1960 at age 76, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, her expression peaceful and resilient. "My great-grandmother survived," Michelle told the gathered audience. "She did more than just survive. She transcended her suffering. She transformed her trauma into purpose, aiding other women, raising a family, and constructing a life of profound meaning." This photograph no longer symbolizes only her captivity. It now represents her defiance, her bravery, and her determined refusal to be erased from history. Rebecca then spoke to the attendees. For 120 years, Louisa's cry for help went unseen, but she left it there regardless, trusting that one day someone would look carefully enough to recognize it. Her story is not merely about one woman's ordeal, it is about the systematic abuse enabled by racist legislation and social systems. It is about the innumerable black women who were similarly victimized without any hope of justice, and it is about the remarkable resilience of those who endured and built lives of dignity in spite of every force designed to break them. In the months that followed, as thousands of visitors walked through the exhibition, they saw Louisa's hand signal, read her story, and finally understood the truth that had been concealed for over a century. The photograph had ultimately achieved its purpose. It could not save Louisa in her own time, but it served as an enduring testament that prevented her story from being forgotten. Her silent scream had finally been heard, and in being heard, it gave voice to the countless others whose stories had been buried by history's deliberate forgetting.